Famous economist reveals what happened during an 11-minute call between Washington and Beijing. 11 minutes. That's all it took to change everything. 11 minutes on a secure phone line between Washington and Beijing. 11 minutes that would reshape global trade, crash stock markets, and set in motion events that are still affecting your bank account today. I'm going to tell you exactly what was said in that call, word for word. And more importantly, I'm going to tell you what wasn't said. Because sometimes what you don't say matters more than what you do. And in those 11 minutes, both sides said everything and nothing at the same time. The economist who revealed this wasn't supposed to talk. They signed NDAs, they have security clearances. But years later, with enough distance and enough frustration watching the same mistakes being repeated, they decided the world needed to know. Because this wasn't just a diplomatic phone call. This was the moment when two superpowers realized they were heading toward economic war, and neither side was willing to hit the brakes. Before we dive into what was actually said, let me set the context. Because without understanding the pressure cooker environment leading up to this call, you won't appreciate how insane it is that it only lasted 11 minutes. It's March 2018. Trump has been president for just over a year. His administration has been investigating Chinese trade practices, intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers. The Section 301 investigation has just concluded that China has been systematically stealing American technology and manipulating trade to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars annually. The first round of tariffs is about to be announced, 25% on $50 billion of Chinese imports. Beijing is furious. They've been sending signals through back channels that this is unacceptable, that there will be retaliation, that America is making a historic mistake. Wall Street is panicking. The Dow has dropped 1,000 points in a week. Every major CEO is calling the White House begging them not to start a trade war. But the political pressure is going the other way. Both parties in Congress are actually united on China for once. Democrats are angry about job losses in the Rust Belt. Republicans are angry about intellectual property theft and national security threats. So senior officials in both governments decide they need to talk. Not a formal summit, not a public negotiation, just a call, a chance to take the temperature, to see if there's any room for de-escalation before this spirals completely out of control. The American side of the call included the Treasury Secretary, the trade representative, and two senior economists who had been working on the China file for years. One of those economists is my source. On the Chinese side, senior officials from the Ministry of Commerce, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and economic advisors to the top leadership. The call was scheduled for 30 minutes. It lasted 11. Here's how it started. The American Treasury Secretary opened with what he thought was a reasonable framework. He laid out the American position. We're not trying to contain China's economic growth. We're not trying to keep China poor, but we need to see fundamental changes in how China treats American companies, American intellectual property, and market access. Specifically, 3 things. 1. Enforce technology transfer as a condition for market access. 2. Stop subsidizing state-owned enterprises in ways that undermine fair competition. 3. Open Chinese markets to American companies on the same terms that Chinese companies enjoy in America. The proposal was that these changes would happen over a defined timeline, maybe 5 years, with clear benchmarks that could be measured, and in return, the tariffs would be gradually reduced and eventually eliminated. Both sides save face. Both sides can claim victory. China gets time to adjust. America gets the structural changes it wants. The American side thought this was generous. They thought Beijing would counter-offer, maybe ask for 7 years instead of 5, maybe negotiate which sectors would open first, maybe argue about the benchmarks. That's how negotiations work, right? The response from Beijing was not what they expected. The lead Chinese official said, and I'm paraphrasing here because this was translated from Mandarin, that China does not respond to threats, that China has 5,000 years of history and has never bowed to foreign pressure, that the American accusations of intellectual property theft are exaggerated and ignore China's own innovations, that American companies benefit enormously from access to the Chinese market and should not complain about the terms of access. Then came the key line. The line that made the economist on the American side realize this call was going nowhere. The Chinese official said that China would be willing to discuss these issues through normal diplomatic channels over time, but that any attempt to force China's hand through tariffs would be met with equivalent retaliation and would only damage both economies. Notice what that statement doesn't include. It doesn't include any acknowledgement that the American concerns are valid. It doesn't include any specific proposals for how to address those concerns. It doesn't include any timeline or benchmarks. It's pure diplomatic positioning. It's the language you use when you're not actually negotiating. The American Treasury Secretary tried to push back. He said, "Look, we're not trying to humiliate China. We understand that domestic politics in Beijing are complicated, but we have domestic politics too, and the American political consensus on China has shifted fundamentally. Congress is breathing down our necks. If we don't get real changes, the tariffs are going forward, and once they're in place, it becomes much harder to remove them." The Chinese side responded that they understood American domestic politics, but that China also has domestic considerations, that Xi Jinping has consolidated power around a narrative of Chinese strength and rejuvenation, that backing down to American pressure would be seen as weakness, that the Chinese people would not accept their government being dictated to by Washington. And then one of the Chinese economists said something that the American economist on the call never forgot. He said in English, "You think you have more leverage than you do." Think about that statement. It's not diplomatic language. It's not carefully calibrated messaging. It's a direct challenge. It's saying, "You're miscalculating. You think we need you more than you need us. You're wrong." The American economist wanted to respond. They wanted to explain that actually, the US does have more leverage because China runs a massive trade surplus with America, because Chinese companies need access to American technology and capital markets, because the dollar dominates global finance. But they weren't the ones leading the call. Instead, the trade representative came in, and this is where things got tense. He said that the United States has been patient for 20 years, that we allowed China into the WTO in 2001 with the understanding that China would gradually reform and open its economy, that instead China has become more mercantilist, more state-directed, more closed, that the promises made in 2001 haven't been kept, and that the time for patience is over. The Chinese response was that China never agreed to become a carbon copy of the American economic system, that China has its own model, socialism with Chinese characteristics, and that this model has lifted 800 million people out of poverty and created the second largest economy in the world, that America doesn't get to dictate what economic system China uses. Now here's where the economist's account gets really interesting, because he says that at this point, both sides realized they were talking past each other, that there was a fundamental incompatibility in how they saw the situation. The Americans saw this as a negotiation about specific trade practices, about intellectual property rules and market access and subsidies, technical issues that could be solved with the right framework and enough goodwill. The Chinese saw this as an attempt by a declining hegemon to constrain a rising power, about America trying to keep China down because it's afraid of being surpassed, about geopolitics and national pride and historical grievances going back to the century of humiliation. When you have that fundamental a disconnect in how you frame the problem, you can't negotiate. You're not even in the same conversation. The American side made one more attempt. They said, "Look, let's forget the big picture for a moment. Can we at least agree on some small confidence-building measures? Maybe China buys more American agricultural products? Maybe we set up a working group on intellectual property? Maybe we delay the tariff implementation by 90 days to give negotiations a chance?" The Chinese side said they would consider purchasing more American products if it made economic sense, but not as a concession to political pressure. They said they were always open to dialogue on technical issues, but they were clear that any tariffs would be met with immediate retaliation. And then, 9 minutes into a call scheduled for 30 minutes, the senior Chinese official said that he had another commitment and needed to end the call. He thanked his American counterparts for their time. He said he hoped both sides would act with wisdom and restraint. And then he hung up. 11 minutes total, 9 minutes of substance, and absolutely nothing accomplished. The American side sat there in stunned silence. The economist told me they all looked at each other and realized the same thing. We're going to have a trade war. This isn't posturing. This isn't negotiating tactics. Both sides are actually going to do this. The Treasury Secretary asked the economists, "What happens now? What are the economic consequences?" And the economists laid it out. They said, "If we go forward with tariffs, China retaliates. Then we escalate. Then they escalate. Companies start pulling supply chains out of China, but that takes years and costs billions. In the short term, you get supply disruptions, higher prices, and economic uncertainty. Stock markets crash, investment plans get delayed, global growth slows. The Treasury Secretary asked, "How bad does it get?" The economist said, "That depends on whether this stays economic or becomes technological and financial. If it's just tariffs on goods, that's manageable. Painful, but manageable. But if we start restricting technology exports, if we start weaponizing the financial system, if we start forcing countries to choose sides, then we're talking about a fundamental restructuring of the global economy. We're talking about decades of disruption." The Treasury Secretary asked, "What are the odds it stays contained?" The economist said, "Close to zero. Once you start down this path, the momentum becomes unstoppable." Hawks on both sides use every escalation to justify further escalation. Companies start making long-term decisions based on a world where the US and China are competitors, not partners. And once those decisions are made, once factories are moved and supply chains are reorganized, you can't just undo them because the political winds change. 3 weeks later, the tariffs were announced. China retaliated within hours, and we were off to the races. But here's what most people don't understand. The trade war, the tariffs, the retaliation, all of that was just the surface. The real story was happening underneath. In boardrooms and government agencies and think tanks, people on both sides were asking, if we can't work with China on trade, can we work with them on anything? The technology restrictions came next. First on Huawei, then on semiconductor equipment, then on artificial intelligence chips. The logic was simple. If China is a strategic competitor, we can't sell them the technology that will help them compete with us. China responded by launching massive initiatives to become self-sufficient in semiconductors, in aviation, in software. The Made in China 2025 plan went into overdrive. Billions of dollars poured into domestic alternatives to American technology. The financial decoupling started more slowly, but it's accelerating now. Chinese companies are delisting from American stock exchanges. American pension funds are pulling out of Chinese investments. Alternative payment systems are being developed to reduce dependence on the dollar. And all of it traces back to those 11 minutes. To a phone call where both sides realized they couldn't bridge their fundamental differences. Where both sides chose pride over pragmatism, where both sides decided that backing down would be worse than fighting. The economist who witnessed this call has spent the years since trying to get people to understand what happened, not just the tactical mistakes, but the strategic blindness. He argues that both sides had options. Both sides could have found face-saving compromises, but both sides were trapped by domestic politics and nationalist narratives. On the American side, Trump had campaigned on getting tough with China. His base expected action. The foreign policy establishment, both Republican and Democrat, had turned hawkish on China. Any sign of weakness would be attacked mercilessly. So even if Trump wanted to compromise, which is debatable, the political space for compromise was tiny. On the Chinese side, Xi Jinping had spent years building up a personality cult around strength and rejuvenation, the Chinese dream, the great revival of the Chinese nation, making China strong again after the humiliation of the 19th and early 20th centuries. In that narrative, backing down to American threats would be devastating. It would undermine the entire legitimacy of Xi's leadership. So you had two leaders who couldn't afford to be seen as weak, representing two countries with incompatible visions of how the global economy should work, talking past each other for 11 minutes before giving up. The economist's biggest frustration is that this was avoidable. Not easy to avoid, not simple, but avoidable. If the call had happened earlier, before positions hardened, if both sides had sent different people empowered to actually negotiate rather than just state positions. If there had been months of groundwork laid through back channels before the call, if both sides had been willing to think creatively about face-saving formulas. But none of that happened. Instead, you had a call that was set up at the last minute, with officials who had limited room to maneuver, both sides hoping the other would blink, and 11 minutes of conversation that accomplished nothing except confirming that neither side was blinking. Want to know the saddest part? 3 years later, after billions in tariffs and trillions in economic disruption, the Biden administration tried to restart negotiations. And you know what happened? Almost the exact same conversation. Different people, same positions, same fundamental incompatibility. China still won't agree to fundamental structural reforms. America still won't drop technology restrictions and tariffs without those reforms. Both sides are now so invested in the confrontation that backing down would be politically devastating. The Economist predicts that we're going to be living with this confrontation for decades, not because it's the optimal outcome for either side, not because it makes economic sense, but because both sides have painted themselves into corners where compromise equals weakness. What does this mean for you? For your money? For your future? It means you're living in a world where the two largest economies are fundamentally opposed, where supply chains are being reorganized for resilience rather than efficiency, where technology is splitting into incompatible ecosystems, where countries are being forced to choose sides. It means higher prices. It means slower growth. It means more volatility. It means geopolitical risk is now a permanent feature of investment decisions. And it all traces back to 11 minutes. 11 minutes where two superpowers could have found a path forward and chose confrontation instead. The Economist still has the notes from that call, still remembers the exact moment when he realized it was hopeless, still wonders what would have happened if someone had said something different, if the Chinese official hadn't ended the call early, if the American side had framed things differently, if. But history doesn't run on ifs. History runs on what actually happened. And what happened in those 11 minutes set us on the path we're still on today. Two countries, two visions of the future, 11 minutes of conversation, and decades of consequences. That's the story. That's what really happened. And that's why your world looks the way it does today.